Okay, hello, welcome everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the first installment of our speaker series, ISHQ, which stands for Issues in Society, History, and Queerness. ISHQ series is our flagship speaker series at the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University. My name is Shiv Sharma, and I work at the center, and I'm here to sort of facilitate this session today. The first is ISHQ session for this semester, called Private Paths. And we have here Subha Vijeswari Vardena, who is a queer feminist activist, researcher, writer, and blogger from Colombo, Sri Lanka. And she's been writing for more than a decade on a wide range of issues pertaining to gender and sexuality. And her writing has been published online, in print, in Sri Lanka, India, UK, and Australia. She is currently working at the Kriya World, which is a feminist human rights organization, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. Today, she's here to talk to us about sexuality in the age of digital media, especially in relation to censorship and the questions of obscenity and so on. So that's it from me. Just in terms of the format, we'll have Subha speak to us for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for audience questions. While the talk is on, any question that comes to your mind, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen that you're at, and please feel free to post your questions. Me and my colleague Alankrita, who will reappear at the end of this session, we will be curating the questions for Subha, which we'll take up in the last 15 to 20 minutes of the session. So Subha, all yours. I'm going to turn my video off.
Okay, thanks so much, Shiv. Though I would have loved to have Alankrita and Shiv have their video on, because I was just saying the webinar format is a little bit like talking to myself because I can't see all you wonderful people. But I can see all of your names here in the room. So thanks very much for joining us, and really thanks so much to the center. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be asked to be with you this evening and to speak. So I'll just be speaking this evening. It's actually based on an essay that I wrote last year, and I can share the details with you at the end of the talk. So I'm really just going to be talking about censorship and sexuality in the digital age. And like Shiv said, please feel free to drop your questions or comments or thoughts while I'm speaking. Like, this is not, it's not, I don't want it to be very formal. And I'm more than happy to hear from you. So can we move to the next slide, please? Right, so I always love this quote from Foucault, because I think it really kind of just speaks to the issue of how censorship on sexuality, the regulation and control of sexuality in terms of censorship, has always kind of been interested in blocking expression, but in its interest in blocking expression actually has ended up actually really always opening discourse about sexuality and sexual expression, in itself. So I think in a way censorship has always had a very interesting intimate relationship with sexual expression, right? It's not an easy black and white. It's not just the antagonist. It has actually had an almost kind of close, intimate relationship with expression. Slide, please. Thanks. Just one sec. Let me just get my... Okay, so earlier last year, the telecommunications minister of Bangladesh declared a quote unquote war on pornography, blocking access to around 20,000 websites and banning TikTok, the Chinese owned video production and sharing app. The move came after a petition citing obscenity was filed by a civil society organization with the High Court in November of 2018. India followed suit, calling for a ban on TikTok over pornography concerns in April last year, though the ban has now been lifted. In Indonesia, TikTok ran into major trouble when the government accused it of disseminating pornographic and blasphemous content. Slide, please. But researchers in Sri Lanka have recently pointed to how TikTok is actually being used as a platform for performance and play by women. Slide, please. This is the essay. So I'll just kind of continuously do this as well. I'll just put up titles and writers that I think are interesting for everyone to check out later if they want. So this is the essay that I was referring to, which is a really, really interesting kind of look at women on TikTok in Sri Lanka. So of course, it's not the first time that something that's being instrumentalized in the service of women's expression, particularly women's sexual expression, has been blackmarked as dangerous and obscene. In fact, this is exactly how it goes. Historically, content which expresses women's desire or sexuality, or indeed any expression of desire and sexuality considered non-normative, has been first up on the chopping block, labeled obscene. And it is not just governments who justify censorship by claiming obscenity. YouTube is just one of the major internet corporations who have come under fire for the censorship of, for example, LGBTIQ content, under restrictions meant to curb content considered pornographic or offensive. Restrictions on such platforms, which are meant to curtail material considered sexual and therefore deemed harmful, have categorically been shown to unfairly affect the LGBTIQ community and content by LGBTIQ people, and also typically content by women. The link between anything considered pornography and harm has been made, of course, time and time again. And indeed, the debate about pornography has been raging for decades in our own backyard. And by our, I mean feminists. It remains at the root of a major feminist fault line. Slide, please. So do these people look familiar to? And I really think this quote by Catherine McKinnon is quite interesting. It's one of her sort of most famous things. So in 1983 in the United States, feminist scholars Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin were brought in to draft amendments to the Minneapolis Civil Rights Ordinance as a response to growing concern about the city's adult entertainment industry. Slide, please. They wrote an amendment that opponents saw as a de facto ban, articulating sexually explicit material and its production and sale as a violation of women's rights. Quote, the sexually explicit subordination of women graphically depicted as a form of discrimination on the basis of sex. So they're basically saying sexually explicit material equals violence against women. Though the ordinance was struck down and later declared unconstitutional, this heralded the gathering of momentum of an anti-pornography movement. On the other side, other kinds of feminists, now, feminists that we might call sex-positive feminists, tried to problematize the reductive narratives about violence, harm, and exploitation, claiming anti-pornography arguments authorized a censorial state to further prohibit the expression of female expression and sexuality, fundamentally ignored the fact of women's agency, and diminished the political significance of women's sexual pleasure in a patriarchal world. Largely, as we know, feminists still remain divided on how we should assess porn and how we understand it. In India, in a pre-internet era where the Hindu right wing and the secular women's movement agreed on almost nothing, they came together in their fight against obscenity when the release of the film Khalnayak in 1993 and the film's most popular song, Choli Ke Piche Kya Hai, translating to What's Behind Your Blouse, caught everyone's attention. Slide, please. This is, of course, the iconic Madhuri Dixit. Yeah, let's stay on her for a minute. Thank you. A petition filed at the Delhi High Court, which called for the deletion of the song from the film, as well as a ban on audio cassette sales, stated the song was, quote, vulgar, against public morality and decency, end quote. The language around obscenity forms one of the key, slide, please. Yeah, and this is the essay here that I would recommend everyone read. So the language around obscenity forms one of the key legal bases for censorship in many countries. The idea seems to originate from colonial era laws around obscenity, which aim to criminalize sexual expression and sexuality related material, which could include educational material, as it was considered harmful to society. In many contexts, as we know, colonial criminal law went further, criminalizing aspects of sexual behavior, even if done in private, deemed, quote, unnatural. Sexual expression is still widely considered harmful to society with no real proof, but not for a lack of investigation. With pornography, for example, innumerable studies have been done since the 1970s to investigate links between the consumption of pornography and harm. It turns out to date, there's no conclusive evidence to show that this link can be made. Trying to make a causal link between pornography and harm has been proven problematic time and again, not just empirically, but methodologically as well, primarily because of a continuing lack of clarity and agreement on what we even mean by pornography and what we mean by harm. If we want to understand the real reach of these laws, that is to say their ideological reach, they have to be considered as a sort of a whole, a part of the same project, fundamentally underpinned by their shared goals to surveil, regulate, and control sexuality through censorship and criminalization of behavior under the guise of protection. Typically, who is being protected? It's women and children. Women and children are still widely considered in need of protection from sexuality, particularly their own. Slide, please. So these are, I'm sure everyone knows these famous books because they were obviously the, the heart of many big debates in the colonial, in the Victorian era, debates about censorship, because these were some of the most sort of famous banned books, and they were, about women's sexuality, really, both written by men though. Governments continue to care a great deal about the internet being a medium through which sexual and erotic material can be made and shared. So this has become a common justification for state regulation of the internet. Slide, please. Right. So for example, India's Act of 2008 has several clauses pertaining to obscenity and sexual material. Section 67 and 67A both outlaw the electronic publishing of obscene material or any material recording of sexual acts with no reference to consent. Though Section 66E, interestingly, explicitly draws on the language of consent. Quote, if a person captures, transmits, or publishes images of a person's private parts without his/her consent or knowledge. So Richa Kaul Pate writes, in this respect, Section 66E is a progressive clause that places the absence of consent at the heart of criminalizing an act. However, the principle of consent embedded in this particular provision does not, unfortunately, give us an accurate understanding of the act as a whole. The act remains protectionist in its approach at best and operates on the premise that, as Pate writes, quote, if female sexuality is the culprit, public morality is always the victim. Slide. So governments of countries like China and Russia have gained notoriety for their sweeping internet censorship policies, while other forms of internet regulation, particularly by private actors, are relatively less talked about. As noted before, corporations and governments are seemingly equal partners in a crusade against sexual content, and yet corporations often seem above reproach. Slowly, the tide may be shifting. Facebook, of course, has come under fire in a series of highly publicized Senate hearings in the US, which has led to increased scrutiny and debate about tech corporations' responsibilities to users' rights and human rights more broadly. But it should come as no surprise that conversations about corporate internet regulation are more slow to get airtime. A large part of the regular person's internet experience is shaped predominantly by about 2 or 3 US-based corporations, owned 4 or 5 platforms which are owned more or less by 2 or 3 US-based corporations. It has become almost habit for many of us to point to governments of the global South or non-Western nations as the real purveyors of censorship, rather than turn to the corporate giants who regulate our internet experiences every minute. The crackdown on TikTok, for example, yields many interesting revelations in this regard. What is the role of geopolitics at play here, where a Chinese-owned app has come under censure for not conforming to the mostly West-determined ideas of what constitutes acceptable content? In addition, it raises the question of class and how class-based morality also finds its way into censorship policies. Quote, TikTok has found particular popularity in smaller cities and towns among first-time internet users who don't speak English, says an Indian commentator. And Sachini's and Minoli's paper, their essay, in their paper as well, they also address the issue of class, noting that Sri Lankan women users of TikTok were using the platform to subvert assumptions and, quote, shift norms around women's sexuality, behavior, and class. Facebook and Instagram, owned by Facebook, Twitter and YouTube, owned by Google, all have their own user guidelines used by thousands of content moderators, which form the basis for content moderation. Though it's titled sort of harmless things like community standards, these guidelines are basically frameworks for censorship and regulation. Furthermore, all content moderation across most of the platforms depend on us. They depend on reports from other users. Reporting objectionable content is encouraged. This exercise both cultivates a culture of community surveillance as well as exacts unpaid labor from platform users, a practice which commentators have come to call outsourced content moderation. So unsurprisingly, all major platforms have shown great concern over what they consider sexually explicit material. YouTube's policy states, quote, explicit content meant to be sexually gratifying, like pornography, is not allowed on YouTube. So sexual gratification is not allowed. The Twitter rules define adult content, which is disallowed, as, quote, any media that is pornographic and or may be intended to cause sexual arousal. So sexual arousal and gratification are definitely unacceptable. Facebook disallows adult nudity and sexual activity and, quote, the sexual exploitation of both children and adults, which includes but isn't limited to breaches of consent, and explicitly disallows sexual solicitation even between adults. Now, it's really important to note that none of these guidelines actually give any definitive sort of framework for what they mean by pornography, what they mean by sexual exploitation, and so on, right? So this language is just being used, but actually it can mean anything. And that's really what is concerning. So Facebook also elaborately describes what parts of the body it considers sexually explicit by default, right? And this is where what Foucault was saying comes into play. So by not wanting to talk about sex, we end up always talking about sex. So Facebook, if you look at, the sort of community guidelines, for example, they really in great detail say genitalia, buttocks, etc., and really kind of have a list of body parts that you're not allowed to show for the reason that it's somehow considered sexually explicit. Though many of these policies seem to draw from the logic of the colonial arguments about obscenity, their language is, of course, deliberately different, right? But it's important to remember that they are effectively setting out to perform the same function as those colonial era laws in the digital age. So all major, I'll just stop here. So I just wanted to share this image and some others with you. Alankrita, maybe we could show those other images now. So I just wanted to share what kinds of things have been banned on Instagram. I mean, this is one of them, this amazing black and white photo of this person. But there's, someone started a project basically where they asked people to start sending in images that had been taken down from, and this is just Instagram. And then they literally got hundreds of submissions, within a couple of days from all over the world. And then I think she started just kind of collating them. And I think, in fact, she turned it into a book. So these are just, Alankrita, you can just, yeah, that's amazing. And then you can just click, that arrow and just, yeah. So these are just a quick, just a tiny sample of I think the hundreds of images that this person received, which are all banned on Instagram. So as you can see, there's no real, I mean, this is okay. This is kind of connected by nudity, let's say, the first few images that we saw. Keep going. Yeah, so this, like, I don't know what that is. Like, I don't know what the basis for that is. And if you just keep going a little bit more to the right. Yeah, so this one is very interesting. So this was taken down from Instagram, and we don't really know why. Like, it's super interesting, but this was somehow not allowed. I think there's a couple more, yeah. Yeah, I love this one. This is like this older woman who had to have some surgery in her breasts, I think, to remove part of her breasts as a cancer survivor. And then this picture was taken down, basically. Yeah, so any kind of nudity, but, you know, yeah. Thank you. We can go back to the slides as well. Thank you. Yeah, so all major platforms have come under some scrutiny at this point. You know, and these are the people who are calling themselves the guardians of free speech, you know, and that's, of course, what's really interesting about this whole thing. Yeah, you know, in relation to, you know, they have all come under some amount of scrutiny in relation to how these policies are actually affecting the lives of real people. So the Free the Nipple campaign, of course, as I think many of you may already know something about, and its social media incarnation shone a light on the hypocrisy and sexism embedded in the blanket censure, which, you know, which basically was really about women's breasts, right? It's not about all nipples. And I think we know by now that many internet users have really proven that time and time again by uploading pictures of male nipples or the woman's nipple very close up, and then that not being censored. So we really know that it's somehow about the woman's breast, that is the thing that that is being censored, right? And here I love these. I just chose these two pictures because I think this is a really nice, you know, illustration of one person, of course, Miley Cyrus, doing the Free the Nipple thing in public, in, you know, in physical public space. And I think that's Kourtney Kardashian, of course, doing it online on Instagram. And you can see, you know, she's had to put the little emojis on her nipples because otherwise it gets taken down. So a lot of very high profile celebrities are also kind of involved in this Free the Nipple conversation, which was pretty interesting. So yeah, I mean, it's shown, you know, this kind of campaign shone a light on the hypocrisy and sexism that's embedded in the blanket censure of women's breasts online. But if the changes in some of the social media policies on nudity are a reflection of the nipple debate, then, you know, because there was a lot of pushback, and then, you know, some of the platforms did kind of try to adjust their policies. And what they did to adjust their policies was they tried to then make a distinction between, again, the image of the breast as sexual versus the image of the breast as not sexual, right? So they said, as long as the context isn't sexual, then it's fine. So, you know, for example, a mother feeding a baby should be fine, right? And so on. So if the changes in some of the social media policies on nudity are a reflection of the nipple debate, then what we can conclude is that even when breasts emerged victorious in the struggle, they were only acceptable in non-sexual contexts. So who is fighting for our right to bear our breasts with all of their sexual connotations, right? Slide. Right, so this is obviously quite famous by now. I'm sure everybody knows what this image is. So Instagram, of course, as you may all remember, came under considerable scrutiny after it took down a series of photographs shared by the now popular poet Rupi Kaur, the first of which showed her sleeping in pants stained by menstrual blood. These images did not, in effect, violate its policy on nudity at all. This was just another illustration of how women's bodies in general and conversations about our sexual and reproductive health are considered sexual in nature and therefore harmful by default. On the other hand, Tumblr was for a while seen as one of the mainstream internet's most open and safe spaces. But in 2018, Tumblr came out with new rules, which meant that, quote, posts that contain adult content will no longer be allowed on Tumblr. Now, if you are ever a user of Tumblr, you would know how outrageous this was. So, quote, adult content, once again here, includes genitalia and, quote, female presenting nipples. Now, Tumblr explicated that, right? So Tumblr's new policies were met with outrage from many users, and it pushed sex workers onto other platforms, as well as a ton of, artists. And sex workers are another community that have really been talking about this and pushing back against this for a long time, right? Sex workers have frequently raised the problems of structural inequality with social media platforms. For example, sex workers were outraged at the verified status granted by Twitter to the account of a fictional sex worker dominatrix as a marketing tool for the new Netflix show. At that time, it was new. Netflix show Bonding, a blue tick that they say is actually really difficult to come by on Twitter if you're a real life sex worker. Instagram sparked outrage from sex workers when it censored the hashtag stripper and other related hashtags, which were being used by sex workers, dancers, and adult entertainers to organize, share work, and gain new employment. And who knows censure better than queer and trans folks? The Electronic Frontier Foundation wrote, quote, policy restrictions on adult content have an outsized impact on LGBTIQ and other marginalized communities. Slide, please. So this is the work of Clarity Haynes, a queer feminist artist, and she wrote extensively about the censure of her work and information about her work online from multiple platforms, including Facebook and Instagram. She wrote, whose nipples get censored? The rule seems to be women's do, men's don't. But there is a spectrum of breasts, just like there's a spectrum of gender. There are infinite possibilities to what breasts can look like, and they can belong to men, women, and non-binary people. Many saw the changes in Tumblr's policies as a part of a chain of events compelled by the passing of FOSTA-SESTA in the US last year, legislation which explicitly governs online sexual content under the quote anti-trafficking umbrella. And because of the immense concentration of internet governance power in a few US-based corporations, laws passed in the US shape internet activity in all our countries. Slide. So increasing corporatization is also cited as a major reason behind the restrictions on adult content, or quote adult content, such as what we've seen with Tumblr, now owned by Verizon. Queer and trans folks, kink communities, queer and other sex workers, adult entertainers, sexual health educators, and of course, many of these are overlapping categories, across the United States are facing profound difficulties staying online amidst a growing trend of queer erasure online. But it's also, like I said, affecting many of us in many of our own countries, right? So Rosa Luz is a trans activist and YouTuber in Brazil who quite frankly states, there are no other options. Once I disclose that I'm trans, I can't get any work. So for me, my YouTube channel was the last option. It was my chance at survival. So they don't, so we can't really kind of evacuate online spaces either, right? Rosa and queer and trans artists in Brazil are struggling under the foot of an extremely conservative regime led by Bolsonaro, but are not willing to give up the spaces they occupy online. Another example is Agents of Ishq, a Mumbai-based project designed to, quote, give sex a good name. Agents of Ishq employ Bollywood-style imagery and symbolism in their outrageous, courageous, and frank tales on desire, sex, consent, queerness, and more in the form of music videos, podcasts, and blog posts shared via YouTube and other social media. LGBTIQ activists from Mexico to Bahrain are fighting at the front lines of the struggle for digital rights against repressive governments and disingenuous corporations, asserting the political importance of tools and methods such as anonymity and fake profiles so that queer and trans organizing and folks can continue to be safe online. So the struggle continues, right? Just because there are all these kinds of varying forces of control what we really need to remember is that people aren't going away. Slide, please. So around the world, LGBTIQ activists, queer feminists, who may identify as sex positive, sex workers, artists, and educators are really leading the charge against the increasingly complex webs of regulation and censorship of sexuality online, where corporate policies interact and intersect with restrictive state law. Slide. Between the increasing conservatism meted out by right-wing governments and leaders and the near complete corporate capture of our governments and our societies, we see interesting shifts in power structure when it comes to the censorship and regulation of sexuality online as well as offline, of course. At times reinforcing the power bases of some of the more traditional players, such as political leaders and lawmakers, and at other times giving more control to new players, such as internet corporations. This kind of regulation has to then be placed within the context of ongoing attacks on sexual and reproductive health and rights, including the rights of those people who identify with diverse gender and sexual gender identities and sexual orientations, and those born with variations in sex characteristics. It becomes increasingly important, therefore, to shift and realign our own focus in some ways, whether in activism and or research. We have to now learn to hold more than one actor accountable, both independently of each other, but also in how they all work together. We have to be especially vigilant about attempts to regulate sexual expression because it may be framed in a language different from the language of censorship we are used to. We have to critically interrogate laws and policies by state and private actors equally, especially if they are allegedly meant to protect. Similarly, we have to sharpen our focus on who is most adversely affected by these attempts to protect, right? We have to substantively examine where the harmful effects of censorship are most keenly felt. And of course, now we have endless research to show that the communities that are most sort of disproportionately affected are LGBTIQ communities, LGBTIQ artists and educators, sex workers, definitely, sex workers who also, stand in as educators and kind of community educators and so on. Slide. The good news is that it is clear that despite continuing double standards being used in the service of the censure and regulation of women's sexualities, queer and non-normative sexualities and sexual expression, many internet users continue to subvert existing frameworks. After all, various forms of sexual expression have survived many centuries and several wars, ideological and legal. In reality, censorship has never really won, but especially not in its battle against sex. Thanks. So that is all from my end of the presentation as such. I would love to hear more from you.
Thank you so much, Subha. That was a wonderful, rich presentation, raises so many questions about, I guess, basically the nature of sexuality itself. And we have some questions up here, so I'm just going to start with some of those.
Yeah.
The first is, of course, is asking what are your thoughts on the intersection between caste and sexuality, specifically in the Indian context. And this, of course, the person is asking also in the context of ban on TikTok, which they think, gave people from all socioeconomic background a medium to express themselves. So what are the ways in which we can talk about, from an intersectional perspective, also about issues of caste with respect to using and accessing digital spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for raising this question. And I think it's such an important question, particularly obviously with in the moment that we are speaking from now, right? And I just want to acknowledge what's happening in India right now. I want to acknowledge what's been happening in Hathras. And of course, it's not one of a kind. And we know that this kind of caste violence has been, going on forever. And it's a really, really a great question. So, the essay that I was referring to, written by Sachini and Minoli, who are Sri Lankan, looks at class, right? Because obviously in Sri Lanka, caste doesn't operate in the same way. It does, I'm not saying it doesn't, but it's just obviously kind of operates and manifests in slightly different ways. But I think that a lot of what they found around class and a lot of the observations that they make are actually really interesting. And I would be really interested to know what you think about whether there are some parallels to caste, right? So one of the important things that I've really observed and learned again is that, like I said, certain kinds of sexuality and sexual expression is allowed, right? And that's what is really important. And what is typically allowed is obviously that which is normative and that which is somehow kind of capitalist in some way, right? Like, kind of sexuality is allowed in the service of capitalism, obviously online all the time. But obviously Dalit women, and particularly I think Dalit queer women, Dalit trans people, and Dalit people who are, women with disabilities, for example, have been saying categorically, our bodies come under censure first. And that has a direct correlation to the fact that their bodies come under censure even in physical public space, right? So there is really a very insidious and violent way in which untouchability does really kind of play out in digital spaces. And that's to do with the discomfort that we have with bodies that are not meant, or that sort of upper caste or kind of normative society don't really want to have to deal with, right? And that is obviously a huge range of bodies. And I think women who are Dalit and also at the intersection of other things, like I said, I think are very much in the crosshairs of that kind of attack, for sure.
Right. I mean, thank you so much, Subha. Maybe I'll take up this next question and I'll add something to it of my own that I would love you to address. So Shweta Singh has asked, how do you see the so-called high art, which normally just includes bare bodies of women, including nipples, where the artists are primarily men, by the way. So, and she writes, context, this art has nothing to do with agency or sexuality of women, but in fact become the objects of male sexuality instead. And what I want to add to that as my question too is that, a lot of the times with respect to different kinds of medium, the sexuality has been analyzed from the perspective of a male gaze, and with respect to films too, right? And in some ways we can make sense of it that, Bollywood film like Kya Kool Hai Hum passes off without any censorship, although it's sort of very explicitly sexual, whereas something like Lipstick Under My Burqa or other films would just get banned. But I'm very curious to also hear from you, and this is adding on to Shweta's question, whether you think male gaze is an appropriate or adequate framework for thinking about these questions, or do you think there is more to it? Should we go beyond it? What would you have to say to that?
Yeah, that is a great question. Thank you, Shweta, for your question. And thanks, Shiv, for really, I think, expanding it and sort of almost putting it on its head. So I think that's a big debate, I think that is I think you went to the heart of one of the, another very big feminist debate. And I think, this framework of the male gaze, I think, which, originally comes from Laura Mulvey and sort of women artists that were operating in that particular moment, has also really been interestingly critiqued by other feminists. And actually, I think Shohini's essay, the one that I kind of flashed up, but yes, absolutely, I can share. I mean, Alankrita, I think, could share the titles. I mean, we could share the titles with you so that you can look them up on your own. But I think, for example, Shohini's work, really questions this thing of the male gaze, because so what some feminists did say as a critique to the Laura Mulvey kind of framework of the male gaze is that it does in some way diminish the agency of women participating in those exercises, right? Whatever they may be. So one of the really interesting, examples that actually came out in this debate at that time was the example of Hitchcock's Rear Window. And I don't know how many of you have seen Rear Window, but if you have, please go back and watch it with this new lens. And if you haven't, definitely watch it anyway. It's a fantastic film. And, for a long time, Rear Window was really seen by feminists who were critiquing cinema as this perfect example of the male gaze, because the girlfriend's character is, they were like, oh, she's very passive. She's very kind of this object. She's very beautiful. She's always very well dressed. she doesn't really have any kind of character trajectory, right? But then other feminists really kind of re-looked at Rear Window and really looked at very interesting, they really broke down the scenes where she enters the room and he's, in his chair, obviously. And there's this one really interesting scene in Rear Window where she switches on the light as she comes into the room. And so, feminists were like, well, actually, light enters the room with her, and she's the one that's doing all the action. She's the one that actually does all of the thinking in the kind of lead up to the climax. So I don't want to spoil too much about the film for those of you who haven't seen it, but I always think that that's a really fascinating part of the debate. But to go to Shweta's question about art, I think that's a really interesting question because, yeah, I completely agree, because what is considered art and nudity in art is really this Renaissance era Western depiction of nudity, right? And that is somehow okay, because that, as you say, is kind of art, and what Clarity Haynes is doing, for example, somehow is not, right? So I think, yeah, I think again, it is really this class-based morality, which is also seeping into all of these regulation and censorship policies. I think particularly with censorship around obscenity, decency, etc., it is a really interesting, I think, class-based kind of morality that is seeping into all of that stuff.
Thank you so much, Subha. I think that you really covered a vast arena of feminist debate in such a short capsule of your comment. The next question actually leads directly from this, and this is from an anonymous attendee. And you kind of touched upon it, but I'm going to add something to make it sort of broader. But the attendee asks, does censorship of women's bodies make people sexualize the women's bodies more? But I'm generally thinking whether censorship is also generative of sexuality itself, and you've been an activist too. So I'm also just thinking about how some of these sort of fault lines has also led to the creation of new political communities. And what do you think about sort of all of that?
Absolutely. And I think that really, again, brings us to the Foucault quote, right, about how censorship itself has been generative of a huge discourse about sexuality and sexual expression. And I really think that we shouldn't see censorship and expression as these two opposite things. Actually, like I said, in a way, I think if we really look at the history of expression and the history of publication and all of this stuff, and the history of censorship, it's always, gone side by side. People have always responded to censorship in extremely generative and constructive ways. And censorship has also responded in many different and interesting ways, right? So I think it's not useful to see it as this kind of antagonistic relationship. I think it's much more interesting to look at how the relationship is much more kind of like this co-producing kind of reality, right? But I think the question about sexualizing, again, brings us back to what is the harm, right? And I think that is what we have to keep coming back to whenever we talk about these words like sexualizing, over-sexualizing, hyper-sexualizing, all of this stuff. I think that comes back to the bottom line question of what is the harm of sexualizing, right? Because we know that links have been made between this kind of content and violence, for example, though that is a completely unscientific link. And like I said, we have never really found that correlation can be made, right? There's no evidence to back that up. So even when we say things like, does it sexualize women? I think we have to kind of step back and say, okay, so what? Like what's wrong with that, right? What is wrong with women being sexualized? What is wrong with women sexualizing ourselves? And I think if we kind of keep coming back to this litmus test of being like, what is the actual harm? I think that's when we really start to get somewhere.
Thank you so much, Suvan. I was just thinking about how, a few years back in India, there was this raging debate also connected to actual violence that played out in the many parts of India actually, over just the exposed waist of Deepika Padukone in the film Padmavat. And of course, the censors pushed the filmmaker to censor out that part of the exposed weight through computer generated graphics, which was interesting for me. That is that sexual part, is that sexualizing the body, or does sexualizing the body come first and we then think about censorship?
Yeah.
So I mean, thank you also the attendee, whoever posted that question for it. But also actually takes me to the next question that I want you to maybe address a little bit, which relates to also the title of your talk, Private Paths. And in all of what you were saying, I think the role of privacy was really important and interesting. And again, you've been an activist too, and you're still working with a lot of political activism in communities, where I feel there is an interesting ways in which privacy becomes both the grounds for activism, and the language of privacy and dignity has been used in the legal battles to obtain certain sexual rights for different communities, especially in queer communities. Whereas that's also, in fact, the grounds on which censorship happens, right? Because sexuality is supposed to be a private thing. That's why it shouldn't be out there in public medium. So what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I don't really agree with that, because I don't think heterosexuality has ever been asked to be private. So I think, again, it's not sexuality that is being asked to be private. Again, it's certain kinds of sexual expression, certain kinds of expressions of sexuality that is asked to be private, right? And so I'm actually really not in agreement with this logic of saying, oh, what we should be fighting for our right to do whatever we want in private. I think, in fact, we should be fighting for our right to do whatever we want, as long as there's no harm, right? So I think, I think, again, it's really interesting what you're saying, because a lot of the language in a lot of this legislation and stuff, again, has this kind of coyness. Like even in the legislation in India, for example, the IT Act says private paths, right? Which I think is kind of just, it's like endearing, because I'm like, oh my God, this is the law of the land. And this is the kind of coyness with which we are talking about our bodies and sex, even when it comes to legislation. And I think that goes to, just the way we are as society as well. But I think the issue of privacy is very interesting, and it's a very tenuous kind of relationship that privacy has had with sexuality, because again, I think it is really certain kinds of sexuality and sexual expression that have always been made to be private.
Thank you so much. So this is on a completely different tangent, but one of the anonymous attendees has asked, how should students go about talking about sex and sexuality from an educational perspective in a way that is taken seriously despite the stigma? Because India greatly lacks sex education, and that is an issue that no one in power seems to want to tackle. But I'm sure this also has resonances with what you've been talking about, right? Because even in the US, I mean, the whole censorship of educational sex materials was actually where a lot of these debates, legal debates on pornography started.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, Sri Lanka is a very good example of this exact thing, actually, how, the kind of moral policing on sexuality has actually led to the banning of educational material. I mean, even as recently as last year, a textbook that was developed for 7th graders by the ministry, right? By the Ministry of Education in Sri Lanka. It was developed by kind of in a very consultative process. It was printed, it was ready for distribution. And in the last minute, religious leaders like Buddhist monks basically kind of had this sort of public outrage. And the entire educational program that these textbooks were meant to sort of precipitate was stopped, So, I mean, like, this is exactly the problem. Like, there's very real life consequences to this kind of thinking, right? And that's the problem. Like, if it was just thinking and we all could be like, oh, well, we can agree to disagree, end of story. But we can't stop there, because it really does have huge impact on on our real lives. I think one of the main issues that we've seen with sex education historically has been, again, that it is extremely kind of patronizing, right? And it doesn't really respect the child or the young person as sexual beings, as beings that also have some access and some knowledge about their own sexuality, especially young people, teenagers, who are definitely bearers of knowledge. So I think that is the main problem that we've had, that a lot of sex education curriculums historically haven't been able to resonate with children and with young people, because it has always kind of been this very clinical, patronizing kind of mode, right? So I think, there has been a lot of advocacy around that, and that's a whole different sort of sphere of work where, now I think there are some universal kind of guidelines for setting up comprehensive sexuality education, because that's what we want to call it now. We want to call it sexuality education, right? Rather than just sex education. So I think there's some very good work being done on that at the global level as well, where people are trying to say there have to be some human rights standards for how we teach sexuality education, right? It can't be based on country-specific norms or morality or social norms or whatever. There have to be some basic stuff that universally we can agree on. And I think a human rights framework, again, there has been very, very helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving us that perspective, and also like that comparative perspective, actually what's happening in Sri Lanka and how we can think about. In fact, I mean, for a research project recently, I was looking into the history of a sex museum, which came up in India, which nobody knew about, but also got shut down, of course, within 5 years. But one of the interesting parts was because it actually stopped talking about sex education, which actually censors sex and only talks about reproduction. But I mean, there's another question, which I think, again, I mean, at some level, it's kind of what you've already talked about, but I think I want to again push it in a sort of broader direction. But Yash is asking, a lot of left-wing people are pro-porn ban, and they justify it by saying more access to porn increases rape, what you were already talking about. And Yash is asking whether, is there any evidence for that, or is it a baseless claim? But I also want to use that as an opportunity to just, you've been talking and kind of trying to grapple with the category of harm. And I'm just wondering what you especially think of that with respect to online spaces. I don't know whether you came across that, but there was an online boys locker room debate that was raging very recently in India. And again, the question becomes, what happened in that online boys locker room? Does that constitute concretely certain harm, which should invite certain censorship? Or is it something that, kind of shifty, but, so how do we unpack harm when we think about these debates?
Yeah.
And can I add to that question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So going back to the point about education and digital spaces, I'm also thinking of the fact that many schools and many universities are holding classes online, where you're often required to turn your camera on and keep it on. And a lot of people from the older generation may be around the house, walking around, because the household is still carrying on as usual. So you do get a peek into people's quote unquote intimate lives, where it could just be somebody, again, not appropriately dressed for a webinar, right? Who's walking in the background. So I'm just thinking of what kind of anxieties are at play, and then who are the different bodies that are going to censor the space then? It could be the family, it could be the law, it could be the school or the college authority, it could be the student themselves. So, and again, to go back to Shiv's question there, where is the harm? Or is it an anxiety about an anticipated harm that's at play?
Yeah, I mean, those are both excellent questions. I just wrote them down because I was like, okay, this is getting like deep. Okay, so the first question about rape and pornography. So, I mean, I think there really is no evidence to show that there is this kind of causal link, right? And like I said, it's not for the lack of being studied. Like, it has been investigated from the time that this became a debate, like we talked about with Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin from the 60s. These kinds of massive debates have been raising. So, like investigations have been done, like studies extensively, it has been investigated. I think the other problem is that when we do that, it again shifts the blame, right? It shifts the blame from the perpetrator to something else. So I think it's another way of really not saying who is really accountable for violence, right? Who is really accountable for rape or however you want to, whatever you want to describe it as. And feminists have again tried to say it's the perpetrator And then it's the state, right? It's the state is also, of course, always responsible. Even when violence between two individuals occur, the state always has an accountability to protect our rights and to ensure that, you know, justice in however that looks in that context is done. So I think, again, this kind of attempt to link pornography to violence, first of all, it's kind of unscientific. Again, it is a bit of a baseless claim. Also because it is very hard to study, because like I said, the kind of variables are really tough. Like nobody has ever really agreed on what we mean by pornography. Nobody has, you know, so in a way, it's also really difficult to study in a kind of a scientific way. And what we do know historically is that porn bans haven't stopped rape, right? It hasn't stopped violence against women. Even in households or societies or communities where people don't have access to pornography or to the internet, we know that violence happens. So, and we know that violence happens within the home, within among intimate partners. So like that, if anything, should kind of concretely show us that pornography is not really going to answer our question about violence, right? I think the second question about sort of what is harm that you said, Shiv, is, again, I think it is, yeah, it's a tough one, you know, and it's a really complex conversation, because even when we talk about harm, we don't talk about certain kinds of people, right? Like violence against sex workers, for example, is just not something that a lot of people talk about when we say violence against women, right? It's usually, we don't mean the rape of sex workers constantly by state actors, by police, for example, or by clients. You know, so all of those things. So it's not just about what is harm, but I think also we have to have a really critical conversation about who do we mean, right? When we gather data and when we do research, etc. And your question about education now, Alankita, and what that's looking like, and again, this very tenuous relationship between the private and the public that the online kind of creates, you know. I think, you know, to just kind of fit into what you were saying, there's a really interesting debate about virtual backgrounds happening, you know, this whole thing about who's using a virtual background, that it, you know, some people think it's really funny, but why are people using virtual backgrounds, right? It's, so again, there's very much a very real class and caste angle, I think, to these conversations, you know, just like you were saying, absolutely. Like not everybody wants to have their camera on, not just for privacy reasons, but also because some people are embarrassed, right? And that is entirely to do with the kind of dominant kind of class and caste narratives that have been constructed around COVID and online and so on. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think you really raised a very, very interesting kind of ongoing conversation.
Thank you so much, Subha, and we're nearly running out of time. So I'm just going to offer my thanks to you again for sort of opening up so many vast and rich areas of debate that we must continue to sort of address, think about as we go further. And just for everyone, that we will definitely share the links that Subha had provided to various readings that you can go through at your own time. Thank you all for joining us today. Just to flag that we will be back next month with a very different format and speaker series. We're launching what we call Theory and Practice, another speaker series in collaboration with the New York University in the US. And especially the question of caste is going to come up again, because our first panel is going to address, and it's titled Gendered Caste, Sexualized Race. Also thinking about sort of the connections, differences, sort of, and various things that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about race, caste, and sex together. So thank you all. Have a good night, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And if it's okay, I just want to take 1 minute to answer, I think, one really interesting question here.
Yes, please. Yes.
Just about alternative frameworks, because I think that's something that's really useful to start thinking about if you haven't already. Again, I think it's a very complex question. because of course it's very easy to kind of say, okay, we are opposed to censorship, right? And we're opposed to regulation, but then what, right? So I think particularly with the online space, one of the things that feminists have been really thinking about is about kind of community accountability. You know, how can we develop frameworks for kind of staying accountable to each other that aren't relying on censorship, but is rather relying on kind of open communication, transparency, and a sort of a system of accountability, right? Which requires us to kind of accept and acknowledge that we're all equal, and that we're all, you know, kind of equal rights bearers and equal bearers of power in some space. So I think for those kinds of frameworks to really have meaning, we do have to deal with some of the really structural power imbalances that play out in online space as well. As long as those kinds of power imbalances exist, I think we can't really think about more feminist kind of methodologies for, you know, having safe spaces, basically, that aren't violent and that aren't, you know, like difficult for people. So I think that's kind of my only idea about an alternative framework. I know that's very vague, but, you know, we have to think about this together, basically. I think that's where I would end, yeah.
Thank you so much, Subha. That's actually a very sort of important and positive note on which you've ended, which also addresses another question about systemic problems. So we hope we all take some of these pointers and thoughts from this session and think within our own spaces how to address these issues which are able to tackle these fault lines, but also look at the systemic problem, systemic picture. Thank you so much, Subha, and thank you all tonight for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.